Hi and welcome to a special IT News AI Innovation podcast. I'm Nate Cochran, IT News contributing editor. And with me is Brennan Steve Anderton, who over the next 15 minutes or so will share with us what he knows about kicking an AI innovation program into high gear. Welcome to IT News, Steve.
Thanks, Nate. Lovely to be here.
Steve, as head of digital solutions at one of Australia's biggest IT solutions providers, you recently crisscrossed the nation discussing enterprises' AI hopes and aspirations. From those conversations, what impressions did you form about the state of AI readiness and adoption in Aussie businesses?
It was I think, a 5-state tour, seeing probably around between 150, 160, ranging from business to IT to finance, those kind of people. But what we saw was quite limited in terms of adoption, but a lot of interest, which was through varying stages. There were lots of organizations in terms of their maturity in their adoption life cycle, but also their readiness. But so a lot of interesting pieces came out, and from a very diverse range of industries as well.
I definitely detect that there's a tangible excitement out there in the market, but also a fair bit of fear and inertia, especially among some of those executives who are being tasked with developing the AI strategies within their businesses. Speaking to them, what did you find were their primary concerns, and how does that impact their ability to invest purposefully, or in some cases even know where to begin?
Look, and again, because of the varying nature of the organizations we had at the table, there was various levels of maturity. Some of it was knowing where to start. A lot of the conversation revolved around generative AI. Products like Microsoft Copilot are starting to get into the hands of users, but their actual use and value, they were finding it hard to understand. But the big thing that kind of came out from it was that a lot of CIOs were being asked to go and deploy or trial these products, but there was an inability to prove value and prove the outcome for the business. And so therefore, releasing funding, gaining access to funding was really difficult, because some of the CFOs we had at the table were saying some of these business cases weren't standing up. Obviously, there is opportunity there, and a massive opportunity with the use and deployment of some of these technologies. But there seemed to be quite a big gap between the business and the outcomes they wanted. There definitely were a huge amount of use cases that were discussed in every single one of these breakfast seminars that we did. Also came out in some of the data and some of the research that was provided by our partner Adapt, who was at the table co-presenting with us, was a lot of challenges in terms of being able to prove the value to actually then gain access to funding. And they were saying less than probably 5% of the initiatives that they were standing up were actually going forward into production for a whole varying amount of reasons, be it that the technology wasn't in a fit state, their own platforms weren't in a fit state, but also a lot of it was gaining access to funding because the business case just wasn't standing up.
Did you think any of that disparity was because there was a cognitive dissonance or maybe a bit of a disconnect between where the executives thought they were and actually where they were with regards to their readiness and AI preparedness? And if so, what are some thoughts on how to bridge that gap?
Yeah, and that did come out a fair bit in the conversation. Was the hype in the market was driving a sense of urgency to look into these technology sets, and it was coming from board level and executive to why aren't we using AI? Then there was that kind of gap to what use cases were available in the business. There was a lot of demand, but then how do you fulfill that demand? There was a lack of readiness. There was a perceived readiness across some organizations, but it turned out some of those organizations weren't in a clear state of readiness to adopt this. And also the business case, as I said again, it wasn't stacking up. There just seemed to be a disparity between the alignment of the technology and the outcome to the actual business use case that was put forward, but then proving that to tangible metrics that they can hang their hats on to be able to then invest, securing the knowledge it's going to drive a tangible return to the business.
So did you get the impression then that the reason that these projects or these pilots weren't really achieving excellence or some sort of competitive value was simply because they were just very poorly defined, because no one really knew what success looked like? So it was very hard to actually get a tangible result at the end of the day?
Yeah, and I would say, were they accurately fleshed out? Were the right people in the organization coming together? Don't get me wrong, there are a couple of organizations who came to the table who are really forward thinking, had these innovation frameworks there that were, building these cross-functional teams connected to the business, with the business users, aligned in with the technologists and the technology team to kind of move forward with purpose on defined use cases. had very clear metrics, that very quick, rapid cycles to go and prove it or throw it away. The course of the technology is changing so rapidly that what you put in place today, next quarter might be defunct. So part of that was, how do you prove things really quickly? And are we set up culturally within the business to be able to test this? On the flip side, there was also quite a bit of fear in terms of these technologies are great, but I've heard some horror stories. There's a new form of shadow IT, shadow AI that's coming into the business. These tools are so readily available that users are just signing up to this, and it's starting to proliferate into our business. What do we do? Let's shut down until we know exactly what these tools are, how they operate, how secure our data is. So there was different perspectives at the table, some based on fear and some based on opportunity.
So let's unpack a little bit about that at a very top level. What does a successful AI innovation program look like for an Australian business today looking to get started?
AI is driving a different level of momentum and opportunity, and the need to move and adopt with speed has probably never been so prevalent. But ultimately, if I kind of strip it back, how do you bring cross-functional teams together? How do you understand the use cases? How do you score them and validate them against a set of clearly defined outcomes and metrics? How do you prioritize those? How do you select the right one that's got the right outcome? To then move forward and rapidly prototype. And then there's also a bimodal piece, which is looking underneath at the innovation framework about what it's developing on in terms of your platforms, your solution, your core IT architecture, the security, the platforms, the services, the tooling. Are you set up to then be able to scale that and scale it quickly to take advantage of the opportunity?
We'll delve a little bit into some of those precursors for success in a moment. But before we get into that, I understand that Brennan advocates for what you call a micro-innovation approach. Can you just give us an overview of Brennan's methodology there?
The micro-innovation that we see is really about, exactly like you said, how do you not overinvest in some of these initiatives to prove them really quickly, and putting in place a framework that allows you to do that. And as I kind of touched on earlier, it's around how do you bring the right people together in a room, which is, invariably it will be the business stakeholders who have the use cases. Bring those together in a cross-functional group of people who are empowered to make decisions, who are representatives across the spectrum of what you need to drive that use case to ultimately success. Running through a process which invariably is about coming up with as many ideas as you possibly can, then taking them through that funnel to actually identify which are viable, which are non-viable, which derive the most value to the business in terms of getting that scoring matrix. So it could be evaluating against reducing risk. It could be evaluated against driving revenue into the business, reducing costs, or improve customer experience. Far be it from me to say which organization, what metrics they apply, but invariably that's it at a high level. Scoring those in a matter of a number of workshops over the course of a couple of days, rather than spending weeks and weeks over-analyzing these, then taking those prioritized use cases, and then ultimately selecting the ones you want to take forward into proving, prototyping. And I'm not talking about even an MVP or a final solution, but putting something in the hands of the users that is tangible, something you can prove and give you that confidence to then take forward, looking at those metrics. So when you get to the end of that prototyping phase, which should be in a matter of weeks, not months, is you're able to say the business case will stack up, and getting that funding to take to MVP, to then take that next level of proving and validation and testing, and ultimately to take through and scale. That is really what you're looking for, and to do that in weeks, but that takes a cultural shift in an organization.
And I understand that very few proofs of concept ever made their way into production. What did you put that down to?
Potentially it was the lack of proof of value back to the business. It was really interesting having CFOs at the table. Some of these proof of concepts struggle to actually attach that business value, that tangible value that justifies the investment. But also I think proof of concepts sometimes can be done in isolated environments, and the production environment wasn't ready.
Do you see that maybe the skepticism amongst CFOs and the people who control the purse strings is increasing in lockstep with the hype around AI? And if so, how do you get those CFOs on side to become champions for AI in the business, or at the very least release funds to innovation?
Funding across all initiatives seems to be much more tightly governed and controlled in the current economic climate. So therefore, proving value and justifying investment is absolutely critical. In a customer that we've worked with, where The CFO has actually been one of our key stakeholders, solving a problem that has taken them weeks to produce a report, for example. We've helped them see that in minutes, not days or weeks. That's actually, getting a stakeholder on board like the CFO is absolutely critical. 60% of the CFOs who were polled, and this came from the Adapt research, didn't believe that their own business could build an effective use case based on technology. So that was pretty damning.
So the lesson I take away from that is onboard a sponsor with clout, who's empathetic and who kind of understands the broader spectrum. So beyond that innovation program then, let's dig a little bit into those essential precursors for success. Some people might see this as kind of boring plumbing or governance work, but they're absolutely critical. What are those essential precursors that organizations need in order to sustain that AI success once it gets out of the working group and gets out there into the real world?
The AI technology that's out there at the moment, be it from a generative AI, we're seeing Microsoft Copilot proliferated inside many of our customers at the moment because of the high penetration base of Microsoft 365. It's understanding the data that powers an organization. That's where the gold is. And what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of projects we're putting in place is the data foundation. So good data platform, really strong data governance wrapped around that data platform, data processes and policies, the ability to swiftly bring in new data sources, to ingest them into your data platform, to model that data and present that back to the stakeholders, to the users, to the applications that actually drive the value back to the business users. That's absolutely critical, because if you don't have those in place, you will end up having standalone, isolated solutions. And as I mentioned, the shadow AI that's coming in as well. Or even worse, you're going to get leakage of data and critical data, business critical data outside of your organization. That leads to huge amounts of risk. And on top of that, then you need a modern platform of which you can innovate rapidly on. You don't want to be waiting around having to provision infrastructure or provision services or buy tooling to be able to support these. Using cloud-based platforms, microservices, cloud-native solutions and tooling is absolutely essential to underpin that innovation.
Do you feel that organizations have the necessary foundations for governance, risk and compliance, especially as it relates to the implementation of ethical AI, that they need in order to really accelerate their future AI programs?
From the organizations we spoke to and the organizations we talked to, it's an evolving area. But yeah, the governance, risk, compliance, and around the ethical use of AI in an organization, we'll all be continuing to look at. There's Microsoft Purview we can put in place for some of these solutions that's giving us that governance and visibility across the tool sets. It's an evolving piece where underpinning that is policy and wherever an organization stands from an ethical perspective. And that differs based on every single customer we spoke to.
So moving from the technological and the legal to the people and the personal aspects, I just want to touch on some of those internal cultural challenges, because often it comes down to people in the organization as to how successful any program is. And you've mentioned this a few times, but how do organizations address the rise of shadow Gen AI and allied to that also workers' understandable fear of job loss?
Change and taking the end users on a journey is absolutely critical, not an afterthought. We're doing a lot of work at the moment in that change space around the adoption of AI tooling. It's amazing how it becomes a little bit of an afterthought, but how any organization gets value from any kind of technology implementation is the effort they put in the change, having those change champions, taking them along for the journey. And I think part of that innovation framework is bringing and connecting the business to the very start of that journey. We're seeing, inside our own organization, there is huge demand for generative AI, specifically Copilot, but to go in, the investment's quite high to get that into the hands of every single user. So really understanding the use case, really understanding how it will be adopted and how it will be used, giving someone a tool and expecting them to just use it to drive value is not the way to go forward. Because if you give someone more time back, they will invariably find their time doing something else that might not be driving the value back to the business. So therefore, the training and adoption around the use of that and incorporation into the day job is absolutely essential. But one thing, in terms of there was that fear in terms of, AI taking your job. But one thing that was clear from some of the people that were at the table was that it's not necessarily that AI will take your job, but potentially someone who can use AI is likely to take your job. The new generation coming out from university and school are so ingrained in the use of Gen AI to perform tasks, where that is probably the bigger fear that was around the table, not necessarily AI taking a job away from someone.
Another factor in success, obviously, is making sure the funds are there when they're needed to bring these programs to fruition. What sort of advice do you have for people who are championing AI programs within their organizations to ring fence those resources for innovation, especially in some of those earlier stages where there will be failures, there will be limited success in some areas? How do they ring fence, or how do they keep that budget away from the pressures of the rest of the business, especially when BAU is knocking on its door?
Don't try and eat the elephant all at once. It's around taking bite-sized approach, that micro-innovation approach, as we've spoken about. It's about trying to ring fence an amount of budget to be able to go and attack, at speed and prove to the business the value of innovation. Pick something of value to the business. It will stand out. It will stick out clearly, and prove it through this process before you then scale, and then to get buy-in to seek funding. Because if you try and sell the framework up front that it's going to solve every single issue you've got in your organization, I think it will fail. So I think finding that first use case is absolutely critical, and find something that's very high visibility for the lowest investment and the biggest impact. And once you can do that, is then you can scale from there.
We're coming to the end of our time together, and this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm sure that everyone listening has also taken away just as much as I have. But Steve, to recap, what are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to leave with today regarding their navigation of their AI innovation in their businesses today?
Yeah, look, I think kind of draw back to what came out from the conversations we had with many customers is it's a bimodal approach. Invest in the foundations so you're able to innovate on a stable base. But the other piece is, how do you bring the business closer to technology? How do you align to the business outcomes? How do you align to the strategy the business is moving towards? How do you find those key metrics and the value that the business wants to achieve, and finding those use cases that achieve that? I wouldn't be scared of the hype. Understanding the investments from a technology perspective at the moment is actually quite difficult, based on the fact that everyone is appending the word AI to every single piece of technology and every vendor is pushing it. But really taking a step back and focus your micro-innovation approach on the business outcome and the value, and then having measurable outcomes. Once you can do that, then investment should flow if you can prove value to the business. So don't get too bogged down in the technology. Secure your foundations, but put a framework in place that actually aligns and attaches to the outcomes and the value.
Yeah, never let your reach outstrip your ability. And for those champions who feel ready to move from zero to hero, what's their next practical step to engage with Brennan and start applying some of the insights that we heard today to their own projects and organizations?
From our perspective, the easiest way to get in contact with us is via our website. We're here ready to have the conversation. There's a lot to consider in this space. We've done it before. We've got the right people to come in and have those initial conversations. It starts with an opportunity to have that conversation and to open the door and explore where we go from there.
Thanks, Steve, for sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks, Nate. Much appreciated. Thanks for the opportunity.
You've been listening to Steve Anderton, Brennan's head of digital solutions, show how to take your AI from zero to hero in weeks, not months or even years. Connect with Steve at www.brennanit.com.au to kick your AI innovation program into high gear. I'm Nate Cochran, and until next time, thanks for listening.